All right, guys. Welcome to the Mac Forum Sunday Chat, September 27, 2015 edition. Glad to have you. Hope you find some interesting things in this week's show. The show notes, as usual, will go up afterwards in the Mac Forum thread. We'll have those up probably right after the show without too much of a delay. I've kind of gotten it down to a cut and paste type situation here recently, so that should cut down on the amount of time that it takes to get the notes out. One of the things that I'm making use of now is I've started posting, as you know, the show notes in the link to the show notes, and then all the notes go into a thread in the forum, so you can catch up that way. Everything is hyperlinked. The articles that we talk about are hyperlinked, so you'll be able to check up on the originals of those. And I've been able to make use of Notes' ability to handle hyperlinking, so that when I do the cut and paste, I don't have to go back and repeat the linking process in the forum. Speaking of the forum, first of all, let's get down to the usual forum roundup. We have just over 281,000 members now, the newest of which is Archon 212. Welcome to them and all of the new members who came aboard this week. If you came aboard this week, you might have noticed had a little bit of a problem about midweek. Lots of problems with pages that either would not load correctly or partially loading, things of this nature. And those, we seem to have been, according to the powers that be, victims of a DDoS attack earlier in the week. By Thursday night or Friday, it kind of looked like we had gotten things squared away. But yesterday and today, I experienced more duplicated posts and the like in the last 2 days than I did during the height of the DDoS attack. So things are still rounding into form and trying to get back to normal. Don't let that stop you from posting a question if you have one. Remember that in order to post a question, you need to be a member. Membership is free, unless you choose to upgrade to the premium membership and show your support for the forum. One of the things to keep in mind as we're going through this DDoS attack, it seems like the way to avoid the duplicate posts is go ahead, click on, compose your post, and click on the button to put the post up. And then if you see a sign that says database error, don't click the post button again. Simply close that window and then go back and look and make sure that your post is there. I'm finding that what I'm doing is also, before I make a post, after I've got it all composed, I'm copying it to the clipboard. Just in case it doesn't show and I have to recompose the post, all I have to do is a cut and paste. But it seems like that instead of hitting the button 2, 3, 4 times, that when it generates the phrase database error, the post seems to have actually posted. It just doesn't appear that way to you until you close that page and then come back to it. So that may help you a little bit. We are trying to get that corrected. We are aware of those issues, and as I say, the powers that be, folks that are a little bit above my pay grade, are working on it and should have it squared away before too terribly long. All right, let's go ahead and move on to some other things. We have a thread going in the forum right now about one of the settings that's become available in iOS 9. This is not an issue for some people, but might be for others, depending upon their cell plan and how much data they're using and the like. How much data they're allowed to use under their current plan. As you know, I mentioned last week, I believe it was, that iOS 9 has introduced a feature called Wi-Fi Assist, where if you're in an area where you have a weak Wi-Fi signal, you can use a cell as a kind of a backup to help you. But be aware, though, that you are using cell data when that gets triggered. As I say, for many people, if you're on an unlimited plan or you've got a high volume plan, multi-gigabyte plan, that may not be an issue for you. It could be for some of our users. So I have a link in there to the thread that discusses this a little bit more, including where you can go in the iOS 9 settings to check it out and see whether you want that turned off or on. My suggestion would be that you look at it on a case-by-case basis. I'm not going to give you a blanket statement that says don't invoke this feature, because for some people it's not going to burn enough data to be a significant hit for them. If you're in a situation where you typically have a good Wi-Fi signal, or you are not normally burning through a lot of data, it's not going to be a huge issue for you. If you're in a situation where you routinely encounter a weak cell signal and use this, especially if you're doing a lot of streaming, then it may be more of an issue for you. So when you look at it, keep in mind your usage and how you tend to prefer things, and how you use your iOS devices. Speaking of which, and we talked a little bit last week about iOS 9 allowing ad blockers as part of Safari now. And as you know, in the roughly 36 hours after iOS 9 was officially released and these ad blockers became available in iOS 9, some of the top apps were ad blockers. One developer pulled his after 36 hours of it being either #1 or #2 in the list of ad blocking software. That developer pulled his. We talked about that last week, and it's partly because of the realization that there is a need for some degree of advertising support. A lot of sites that provide the content that we enjoy rely on ad revenue to help keep them afloat. Now, the downside to that, the negative, so to speak, is that some sites have gotten to the border of being ridiculous. My good friend Kurt McLaren over at his iTunes forum site has talked about ad blocking and ads and the revenue stream generated from ads. And he gives you an example in there about just how long certain pages take to load on his slower internet connection. And to the point, in some cases, of the site being unloadable because of a particularly recalcitrant video. And it's gotten to the point on some sites where even with a relatively quick connection, you find going to certain sites annoying. Until for example, until I found a couple of plugins that I liked, had a problem where I kind of hated going to YouTube for a while. I haven't been a big YouTube person to begin with, but I was running into a situation where it seems like all these videos were auto-playing. You click on a site and you go to a video, and whether you were ready for it to start or not, it was auto-playing. And sometimes with the volume compressed and raised to a level that was just annoying. So we see both sides of that. It's one of the reasons I don't go to the macworld.com site more often than I do. Some of their videos, while they are helpful, auto load and kind of get on my nerves because I'm looking up something, I'm trying to read an article, and lo and behold, in the background, here's this, you know, video that's running and annoying. And no offense to Chris Breen, a lot of it's their how-to videos. It's some of Chris's stuff a lot of the time. I like his stuff. He's very knowledgeable. My problem is not with the content. It's the fact that it auto starts. So I very rarely go to that site now. It's no longer one of my go-to sites for information. And yeah, I could run pop-up blockers and configure pop-up blockers, and I do. But you shouldn't expect your users to jump through that kind of hoop. And the article that I linked to in the show notes, Kirk happened to mention that he had read somewhere that someone suggested that avoiding these ads, in other words, running ad blockers, was similar to robbing an Apple store, which I get the point the user's trying to make, but it's a little extreme way to explain it. And to be honest with you, we all go to great lengths in our daily lives to avoid commercials that we don't want to see. You go to watch television, watch broadcast television, and you leave the room when the commercial comes on. Or you record the show on the DVR so you can fast forward through the commercials. We've gone from a situation at one point in television history where I think there was approximately 50 to 52 minutes of content for every 8 minutes of commercials in every hour, and now we're down to 42 to 45 minutes. I've watched a couple of shows on demand recently, and a show that runs an hour when you see it in the normal fashion, when you play it through on demand, is taking 45 to 48 minutes. So you've got a good 12 minutes or so of commercial time. And that's on top of the, what I believe in the industry are known as bugs, those little ads, if you will. They used to just be the logo for the broadcast network, ABC, NBC, CBS, TNT, that kind of thing. But now you're seeing all kinds of animated things, promos for new shows, links to web content that pop up but don't stay on the screen long enough for you to figure out what they are, that kind of thing. So he has some thoughts about that. I'll link to that in the show notes. You'll see that, as usual, he's got some interesting things to say. Also this week, we noticed, we heard over the last several days that several apps in the App Store were hit with a bit of malware called Xcode Ghost. Apple has pulled those, but Xcode Ghost, this little bit of malware, is caused by developers, mostly in China, installing tweaked versions of Xcode, which is the software that's used to develop these applications, develop Mac apps. And the article that I'm going to link to tells you how to check your version of Xcode to see if it's the valid one. I know most users, unless they're programming, may not have Xcode installed. I have it installed, even though I'm not a programmer, because there are a couple of utilities that I run on rare occasions. I've only opened Xcode a handful of times. But essentially, one great way to check to see if you've got a legit Apple version of Xcode is if you downloaded it through the App Store and you have Gatekeeper turned on. Okay, Gatekeeper would flag it if there were an issue. Same thing if you downloaded it through Apple's developer portal. Same thing, it gets checked by Gatekeeper, assuming that you have Gatekeeper turned on. If you got it from some other method, and you've already downloaded it, I believe there's a link in the article that I'm going to link to. There is some information on how to use the terminal to check your version, to make sure that you got a legit version of Xcode that's not hampered by the Xcode Ghost malware. Another thing I saw this week that looked kind of interesting had to do with Apple filing a patent for a smaller or slimmer version of the headphone jack. The standard jack, which has been in use for some time, not only on iOS devices, on Macs, but in a lot of other consumer electronics, is a 3.5 millimeter headphone jack. This is slightly larger. A slightly smaller version of the jack in this patent filing. If you had a headphone jack like this, it would work with existing devices, okay, that rely on the 3.5 millimeter jack. Now, the problem would occur is, in other words, if you're using a 3.5 millimeter jack, this works. If ever anyone goes to using the smaller version of the jack, then it would not work with existing 3.5 millimeter plugs. So if the jack itself is smaller, then it would not work with existing 3.5 millimeter plugs without an adapter of some sort. There's been some speculation that Apple is doing this kind of as a prelude to using Lightning connector as their headphone connector of choice. And Kirk spends some time, he's a big time music guy, he spends some time talking about the positives and negatives of both of these, including whether the Lightning connector-based headphone would be a good idea. For most people, it's probably not. They don't necessarily need it. He has some good reasons for suggesting that, and I'll link those into the article that in the notes. One of the things that you notice is that the use of a Lightning connector, for example, would open up more options for things like, for example, noise cancellation and some other issues, and give you more options for how to deal with that. The problem, of course, is that until that connector became common, you would have difficulty using other devices with it other than Apple devices. Right now, it's basically rumor and speculation as to whether Apple is intending to do that, and we'll see. I take a wait-and-see attitude about most of the Apple rumor and speculation that pops up. All right, along with that, moving over to Cult of Mac, our good buddy Rob Lefebvre over there has some suggestions for settings to change, update, tweak in iOS 9, and some things that you can do. Once again, he has several of these. I suggest that you look through them and choose the ones that fit with the way that you use your device. One of the things that he mentions is the ability to have more than one fingerprint associated with Touch ID. And there are some reasons why you would want to do that. I, for example, have numerous times gone to open my phone and use the wrong thumbprint. Well, you could solve that problem by having more than one thumbprint this time. If you don't use your thumb, if you accidentally use your index finger, sometimes your thumb, other times you could correct it that way. But but there's a host of other settings in iOS 9 that you might want to take a look at and see if you have a need to change them. And Rob, as usual, did a good job of not only explaining the steps, but also in terms of dealing with the possible ramifications of changing certain settings. All right, last week I promised you that I would go through some thoughts that I had about using your iOS device for a remote control. I've been using one for a while now. In fact, I've changed a couple of times. And I'll tell you some of the things that I like, some of the things that I dislike. Today, I'm just going to go through some of the things that I have noticed about these devices in general. Okay? This is not specific to any given device. It's more a function of these devices in general. And then next week, we'll talk about, in a little more depth, about two of the ones that I have the most experience with. First of all, let's just talk about the things that we do in general that when you go to use an iOS device as a remote control. Now, for me, there are some things to like, but there are some things that might be a bigger pain for some people than others. For me, the thing that I like is that the devices that I've tried so far are able to work with my existing gear. So in other words, I can consolidate into, instead of using one remote for each piece of gear involved in the audio setup, I can use one remote to control everything. Not only that, the devices that I've used have the ability to record macros, so that by pushing one button, I can execute a number of steps. And that can be a big deal if you've got a complicated system, if your spouse doesn't like having to remember which steps, or if you're constantly rearranging the order of things, as I sometimes do. You don't have to worry quite so much about, oh, gee, I've got to, conduct a class for everybody so they understand how the stereo works. So that's one of the things that comes into play as an advantage. A potential advantage for these devices as well is the fact that many of them also control things like lights. More and more home automation control is being built into these devices. That has with it its own benefits and drawbacks. One of the drawbacks is you have to be aware of security and how secure your wireless network is. Of course, the great benefit, for example, is that you can control things like lights without having to get up and manually adjust them, manually turn them off or on. That's not a big deal for some people, but if you happen to be disabled or you have lights that are in places that are kind of hard to get to, it's nice and convenient to be able to turn them off from your iPad or from your iPhone. For me, the other things that came into play is with the button configuration for as a potential benefit. The very first multifunction remote that I tried that had macro capability was done by Sony years ago, and it had a screen on it, touch screen, but you had no ability to really rename the buttons on the touch screen. It had a very limited ability to configure that. So that was a problem. for me. With the newer devices, you've got some issues where that's not as big a problem. So there are some things there that you need to check out. With the newer devices, you have a little more ability to configure buttons. Now, the biggest problem with using your iPhone as a remote control is this. Unless you're going to use an older iPhone, or you have one of the devices that doesn't plug directly into the phone, when you leave the house with your phone, your ability to remote control everything may go with you. One of the devices that I tried was the red-eye unit that plugs into the headphone jack of an iPad or an iPhone. If I ever forgot and left the house with that little gizmo attached to my iPad, it meant that anybody in the house couldn't make use of the new macros that I had programmed. So that's something you want to think about. Also, you want to think about the fact that the buttons are generally, you're dealing with a touchscreen. You can't feel for a particular button as you normally would on a standard remote. The remote that I'm using to replace my cable company remote, the buttons have different shapes and sizes. If the lights are off, you can identify a lot of them strictly by the feel and their location. And it doesn't take you long to do that. But that's not true if you're using a remote that has a touchscreen, because all the buttons are flat and that. And it does take a little bit of time to get them programmed and up to speed. That's something that is specific to all of these devices. Some of them, depending on how you have them configured and what you have them do, especially if you use them a lot as a remote, are going to drain the battery a little bit, so you're going to need to have a way to plug it in or keep it charged while you're using it as a remote. Not that it will kill it quickly, but you will notice using a little bit more battery than if you were not using it as a remote, particularly if you're a heavy-duty channel changer like I am. That takes care of most of the common issues that are common to all or almost all of these devices. Some of them will stay in the house and work with multiple iPhones. You have to look at that on a case-by-case basis. But next week, I'll talk to you a little bit about more about the two devices that I've used thus far, that I have the most experience with. I'll talk a little bit about what things I liked, what things I haven't liked so far. The two that I've used have been the Red-Eye Mini, which I believe is no longer in production, and I'm currently using the Blue Mini. And I'll talk about those to some extent because they have somewhat different approaches to controlling remote controls and remote controlling devices. And I'll briefly mention one or two of the others that are on the market. But otherwise, that's going to just about do it for this week. I hope you stay tuned. Next week, I hope you join us, rather, for more comments about the remote control. We'll have a few more tips, tricks, and the like. One of these days, I'll get around to writing up that remote control information for the blog, so you have it there as well. I hope that you've enjoyed the information we've brought to you tonight. And I will see you in the forum during the week, assuming that we're able to post. And if not, until then, I will see you next week. This has been your host, Sylvester Rock, a.k.a. Sly Dude in the forum. And I'll see you somewhere in passing in the forum. And if not, hopefully I'll see you next Sunday. Thanks for joining us, folks.